So this paper again is an update on that offered to the conference in October 2004. At that time, my own study of the Hearth Tax for Bristol and a separate study of Bristol houses to which the work on the Hearth Tax was an input were both still in progress. Happily, both these works are now completed. The study of Bristol houses published in 2014 on the screen there. And there are only 80 copies left, by the way. It will shortly be a rare book. And the Hearth Tax for Bristol, published in 2 linked editions in 2018, the Bristol Record Society and the British Record Society. The Bristol Record Society edition includes a CD as well. So this is a plug for the Bristol Record Society edition. You get a CD as well, which gives all the information that's there at the bottom of the CD. Unusually, the returns for Bristol came mostly from documents held locally from the City of Corporation's chimney book, which we see here. That's the very first page of it. The study of the Hearth Tax for Bristol formed part of a wider study underpinning the study of Bristol houses through documenting the ownership and tenure of land and houses across the medieval and early modern city. The individual tenement histories, we see here an extract from those for High Street, the East Side being an example, being modelled in part on Derek Keane's survey of Winchester. 2 volumes have so far been completed, and plans are in hand to complete this survey for the entire city. That's the first volume, which is now out of print, but is available on the Bristol Record Society's website as a downloadable PDF, as is this one, which is still in print for the University Precinct of Bristol. And these will cover the city as it was by circa 1800. We see here the map of Bristol by James Millard in 1673. And as with London, it has been very convenient to have a map of the city compiled within the period of the Hearth Tax. Bristol had been a city since 1544, when it became the see of a bishop. The church of the dissolved Abbey of St Augustine becoming Bristol Cathedral. Prior to that date, Bristol was a town, founded as a burgh circa 900, and created as a county in its own right in 1373, out of the counties of parts of the counties of Somerset and Gloucestershire. I now want to say a few words about the walking order. By the time of the 2004 conference, it was already evident from analysis of the Hearth Tax returns that the surveys were compiled in a walking order, presenting to the researcher what was then termed a decodable street directory. We can disentangle the construction of documents such as rentals and accounts to identify where people, their compilers, have walked in the past. I will focus especially on the sequences of data because my interest here is in reconstructing the routes followed by the compilers of such documents. The others of such documents from Bristol, the listings of land gable rents, provided what was in effect a street directory for 1295 and later years, enabling the ownership and tenure of recorded buildings to be identified. And so some of the buildings which we see here, we can actually have the location of those in the 1290s and later from those walking order documents. A rental of circa 1300 has provided what in effect is a street directory for 1295 and later years, enabling the ownership and tenure of recorded buildings to be identified, and identifying in turn the identification of a late Saxon bridgehead southeast of Bristol Bridge, which you see in the centre of the historic towns atlas map there, which we've been able to identify as Arthur's Acre. And it's one of those very nice instances where you've done a piece of research in advance of a development that's going to take place, and when the excavation actually happens, there is evidence of the ditch that you predicted would be there. So this is the ditch in section, or a small part of it, around Arthur's Acre. And as I've highlighted elsewhere, a similar approach could be taken to records of other towns and cities. I've made, for instance, one instance is Hull, where Rosebery Horace's reconstruction of the medieval plan of the town through successive rentals placed heavy reliance on the surface sequences of entries arranged in a walking order. The Hearth Tax returns of the 1660s and 70s for Bristol have been similarly identified as recording a walking order. it will be evident that where there are gaps, the names they're given will correspond to intervening houses, thereby completing the directory of occupiers, and in some instances also owners. So you can see here, this is part of the ward of St Mary Redcliffe in the Bristol returns, and the footnotes are locating, giving the topographical information for each building. And if you look at the footnotes below, you will see that it's actually going in walking order down the street. 113, 110, dropping down to 98 and 98 here, then 94 and 99, 93 here. So you can see that the walking order is nicely documented by the evidence from other sources, which is coming together in the Record Society topographical volumes. Catherine Ferguson and Andrew Wareham, familiar to us, involved with the Hearth Tax series, have commented that for the first time in the Hearth Tax series volume, the list of householders are taken here to form the structure of the topographical directory of houses and their occupants using supporting documentary and physical evidence. But this wasn't the first time this had been identified as a possibility. One of the editors of the Cambridgeshire Hearth Tax notes the same, that they detected a walking order in the analysis of villages. So this isn't just towns we're worrying about, concerned here with its villages as well, may give evidence for a walking order. Then I turn to correlate the tenement histories with identified buildings of historic interest. From the 15th century onwards, these individual histories have, for Bristol, enabled the correlation of the tenement histories with identified buildings of historic interest, best illustrated here by looking at the different types of houses to be found in early modern Bristol. And this is a quote from the, which I use in my book, that when we look at how people are thinking about houses in the late medieval and early modern period, we need to look at the language they're using. And in Bristol, they're talking about shop houses and lodges and hall houses and court places. And these are the terms that are used to describe the houses of a chantry's rental portfolio, but they're part of the vocabulary of the residents of Bristol, in the inhabitants of Bristol in the late 15th century, 1473 in fact to be precise. By the mid-17th century, these terms still retained some validity. Large houses ranged around a courtyard would be found close to the river frontages. Houses with open halls were still to be found in several streets. Shop houses were still being constructed in some numbers in several newly laid out streets, and lodges, now known as garden houses, were still being built in gardens away from the urban centre and on the slopes overlooking the city. Many new built houses did not though fall into these categories, were dwellings of an entirely residential character, best understood by turning to perceptions of the mid-17th century, such as Roger North's essay of building. We could also look at the pamphlet of 1678, which was a focus for Ian Warren's recent essay for the publication of the London and Middlesex Hearth Tax. The author of the 1678 pamphlet made a tripartite distinction between the houses built in London since 1620, the great houses, the middle sort of houses, and houses at £4 or £5 per annum. Which houses fell into the first two categories was illustrated by examples. No similar exposition of terminology exists for 17th century Bristol. It is relevant to note that the cartographer James Millard used the term great house for two of those illustrated in the vignettes around his map of 1673. We see here the great house on St Augustine's back. This is the back of it, surviving in the late 19th century. It became the site of a concert hall named as the Colston Hall, but now renamed for reasons which some of you will be familiar with as the Bristol Beacon. And then another great house on Millard's map was the great house in Redcliffe Street, taken from the back of Bristol. And we don't have a photograph of that, but we do have a 18th century illustration, the great house at the bridge. And then we come to another great house. Some of these survived from the medieval period, survivors of later medieval Bristol. And probably the best recorded of these is number 20 Small Street. the subject of probate inventories for 1557, 1560 and 1668. The last coincide conveniently with the entry for Sir Henry Creswick in 1668, but the number of hearths is given as nil, probably because he had just died. In 1662, the number of hearths was noted as 15, and 6 of these are shown on the plan of the ground of the first floor, utilizing the construction of the house as shown by Dolben and Jobbins in the 19th century. And that was the courtyard of the house, a part still surviving today, in fact. And this is the reconstruction of it by Gill Atherton. And from the contents of the house recorded in 1668, a further 7 hearths can be inferred from the presence of hearth equipment, such as andirons and firebacks. 7 rooms, including those for hearths and apprentices, contain no such equipment. If all these had contained hearths but not in use for servants and apprentices, the total would have been 15, precisely matching the figure given in the Hearth Tax return for 1662. 15 or more hearths. This is just an aside, but Gill Atherton actually kindly put on for me for the reconstruction, which was suggested by English Heritage as being a suitable object for reconstruction for the book. This is Charles I and his son admiring Sir Henry Creswick's adornments in the Great Hall. That's just a small aside. Then we come to the deanery of Bristol, and these too could have been considered as great houses. The bishop's house in 1634 was described as the bishop's palace. In the Hearth Tax return was assessed for 14 hearths, but no plan survives to identify their location. But another of the larger houses in the 17th century city was that of the dean of the cathedral, the deanery facing College Green. The only identified plan shows the basement floor below the principal rooms on the piano nobile above. The illustration by Samuel and Nathaniel Buck, part of the view of the city from the northwest, shows a complex of rooms with 4 main chimneys. If each served 3 floors, that would provide 12 fireplaces, roughly the 13 for which the dean, Dr. Glenham, was liable in 1668. A number of houses with 10 or more hearths can be identified as inns in the returns for 1662 and later. In 1662, there were 9 in or close to High Street, some of which we see on the vignettes, the extracts from the 1828 map here. One here, this is the plan by Penny Copeland, who I see is here today, showing a reconstruction of the Nag's Head in Wine Street and High Street, accessible from both streets, as you'll see. And there were also inns in Redcliffe Street, a lot of inns close to the bridge for people approaching the city from the south who wish to stay there. And this is the Red Lion in Redcliffe Street, shown again in a watercolour of the 1820s. And the White Lion in nearby St Thomas Street, not yet unfortunately identified in the Hearth Tax returns. But these are inns close to the centre of the city, and 2 large inns here rebuilt in the late 17th century. Other properties with 10 or more hearths can be identified as industrial premises. These included 3 sugar houses, 2 with 16 hearths and another of 11 hearths. The sugar houses included a medieval house that later became St Peter's Hospital, converted to a sugar manufactory in 1658. We see here the house that was converted to the sugar manufactory, and a plan of it in the 19th century, and a very small part of it still surviving in the grounds of the park that was created on the Blitz site in the centre of Bristol. These are all photographs from the book, enabling the plan of St Peter's Hospital to be reconstructed. But the whole of this, a sugar house by the 17th century. The second sugar house was converted out to St James's Priory. the house on the left becoming that of the manager of the house, and his initials and those of his wife, and the date on the doorway and on the chimney piece inside, with a ceiling very similar to that which was destroyed in 15 Small Street a few years ago, giving similar heraldic information, enabling us to identify that as the house recorded in the Hearth Tax. Jonathan Barry, and one of the co-editors of the Bristol volume, and I concluded that the distribution of the properties with most hearths cannot simply be taken as a sign of where the wealthiest lived, since many of these properties were either inns or industrial premises, used especially for soap or sugar manufacture, rather than the residences of the wealthy, although some of the wealthy did live in parts of these properties, rather complicating the picture. So this is an extract from David Sax's volume, The Widening Gate, and he followed Power in London in using the Hearth Tax as a means of plotting the distribution of wealth across the city, but his conclusions no longer hold water because the districts he's identifying as having large numbers of houses with many hearths are in fact the very districts which include many inns for people coming to stay in the city. Then houses of the middle sort I turn to next. Looking at London, Peter Guillory concluded that between 8 and 10 hearths was the norm for the kind of speculative housing built for a middling sort of market in the late 17th century. In Bristol, as perhaps in London, the introduction of the Hearth Tax from 1662 onwards coincided with the largest new housing developments to have been initiated since the early Middle Ages. From the 1650s onwards, two new areas of housing were developed on the site of the castle demolished in 1656 and in the area known as the Marsh. And many of the houses that were built here could be described as shop houses. These were typically houses having an unheated room serving as a shop on the street frontage at the ground floor, and typically of 3 or 4 stories with an attic above. We see here 2 shop houses from the 1540s, recorded in the Hearth Tax with the information there confirming our conclusion they are shop houses. Many shop houses were built inside the castle and the development I mentioned there, including, and very often on the plans, you'll see that the front room doesn't have a hearth. The hearth is actually absent. This was one of 2 houses of identical plan, built on a plot leased in 1661. Another house on the south side of Castle Street, again, are 2 rooms in depth with the staircase alongside the rear room, but no fireplace in the front room, another shop house. And 2 further along the street, again, no fireplaces in the front room of this one, 70 and 71 High Street, which we see again here in more detail. But no hearths in the front parts of the 2 buildings. And then another appendix cross-section drawings showing the cross-section of some of these shop houses from the information in inventories. Being able to identify the houses from the Hearth Tax returns has enabled us to identify inventories that go with these houses and enable in turn with other information, speculative cross sections of what they might have looked like. The shop house could be built as an elite residence. No, sorry, I'm jumping ahead. More shop houses in the Marsh built in the 1660s. These 2 at 7 and 8 King Street. Again, no hearths in the front room, and the hearth in this one has clearly been added from the visible evidence. But shop houses could also be elite residences as well. This is 12 Welsh back, constructed in the early 17th century. The house of Sir John Langton. The watercolour is a copy of a painting of 1736 made in the 1820s. And on the first floor, a very grand fireplace with a door with mother of pearl inlay, celebrating the year in which Sir John Langton became mayor. And another equally elite house, a very famous house in Bristol in the pre-war period, known as the Dutch House. This was owned by the Glover Robert Winstone, number 1 High Street, and assessed for 3 hearths in 1662. The property records show that the house was built on 2 adjacent parcels of land, each separately leased. The lease for the east part renewed in 1676. The date described on a jetty bracket, which we'll see in a moment. And from one of the 2 owners of the property, a set of plans showing quite remarkably the plan of each floor. One doesn't often get this in a plan book, plans of all floors of the houses. And that was very useful to have. And the jetty bracket with the date 1676 on the shield here, corresponding to the date at which one of the properties, one of the leaseholds changed, was renewed. And Jill Atherton's reconstruction, this is actually the ground floor down here. It looks as though it's a cellar, but this is actually the ground floor. And this is the number of hearths that we can record from the plans, which is at odds with the number recorded in the Hearth Tax. So only 3 hearths in the Hearth Tax, but it must have had at least 6 and was an elite resident, so is likely to have had those. And then I come to entirely residential houses. This is a house, an entirely residential house of the 17th century, with the 17th century gables still surviving behind the later 18th century brick front. Those are the houses we're just looking at. Residential house of the 1660s, built on the right, on the left rather, and number 6 King Street on the right. More residential houses of the same date in Castle Street, 57 Castle Street, and in Frogmore Street, another house, another inn. It bears the date 1606 on the front, but that's just a confusion in the records by somebody's earlier date. This is a 2-room deep dwelling house of the 1660s. And such houses were built also in the cathedral precinct. This house was 1664, again in the Hearth Tax, the number of hearths again corresponding to the number of hearths we could speculate existed in this house. One of the prebends' house, one of the canons' houses in the cathedral precinct. Then I come to the smallest houses, the houses of 1 room on each floor. And the 2 houses, the house beside the steps here, we can actually see in a watercolour of the 1820s. Bristol's remarkable in having this fine set of watercolours collected by a historian in the 1820s, commissioning painters to go out and illustrate the house as he wanted to record in his history. And all the notebooks that were made to accompany his drawings survive. And so one can match these to contemporary plans. This is a small 1-room house, and these are to be found across the city in different places. This one to the west of the one we were just looking at is being demolished in the early 19th century when the watercolourist gets there. But we can correlate with the house of Shidrek Cox, assessed for 2 hearths in 1668, and that does seem to have 2 hearths on the upper floors. And one-room houses, a row of one-room houses being built in the early 17th century, 23 to 9 St Michael's Hill, certainly built by 1637. These were quite substantial buildings of 3 stories with large prominent gabled frontages. Each house contained 3 hearths, but a 4th could always have been accounted for in a workshop or kitchen to the rear, as at that's one of the hearths in one of the front rooms. A 4th hearth could have been accounted for in a workshop or kitchen to the rear, as in 14 to 18 Rosemary Street. We see here a row of 4 houses built by 1656. The ground floor was the principal room for cooking and living. We're looking there at the front, at the bottom here of the plan, that row of 4 houses. The upper rooms accessed by a winder stair set in the corner between stack and rear wall. The inconsistent arrangement of the rooms to the rear indicates that these were possibly added to the houses first built. There are various workshops which could have been accounted for the other hearths. Some of the smallest houses, including some built as rows, were possibly built by entrepreneurs or industrialists wishing to secure and retain the services of a skilled workforce. Before the 16th century, the raquet to the west of Back Street was probably a large garden used for the setting up of racks for the drying of dyed cloths. 10 houses were built here by 1567, and by 1646 the garden around which these had been built had become an additional burial ground for the parish of St Nicholas. By the 1820s, these 12 houses of the 16th or 17th centuries faced the burial ground, all dwellings of just 1 room on each floor. We see here 3 of them. 4 of those on the west side of the garden had small yards, less than half the size of each house. The remaining 8 houses were without any yard or garden beyond the dwelling itself. In 1567 were first recorded. These 10 houses were all held under a lease granted to Edmund Jones, a clothier. So possibly these houses were built initially for his workers. And perhaps the reason why we can't actually find them in the Hearth Tax is the reason that Catherine postulated earlier on, that they might be aggregated under the an entry in the return for the owner of the close as a whole. That is almost certainly the case with this row of houses built in a development known as Avering's Hayes in the late 16th century. By the time of the Hearth Tax, these houses form part of a row within a part of the close that had actually become a glassworks, and the number of hearths that the owner of the glassworks is assessed for corresponds to the number of these small houses around the close as a whole. The rest are not shown because this is just the information from an excavation correlated with the information from historic plans. And the sugar house that became the site of the Colston Hall also had houses for workers, which we can see here in the courtyard. And other smaller houses are scattered around the city, quite a few in streets close to the former city walls, which have large numbers of the exempt in the Hearth Tax returns. And it's possible that some of these smaller houses actually are those of the poorest of the population of Bristol in the Hearth Tax period. So that's the smallest of the residential houses. I now move to the lodge or garden house. These are second dwellings, second residences of the elite of the city, or the wealthiest persons, built on the slopes of the hills surrounding the city. The Red Lodge, the White Lodge, and over here one known as Baber's Tower, and a few others in the area known as the Royal Fort. This is the Red Lodge, built between 1578 and 1589. a courtly lodge or banqueting house within the grounds of a larger house, here the great house on St Augustine's back, now a museum. With a stair turret to the back, which is visible in the basement today, but also on this plan of the early 18th century. And to the east of it, the White Lodge, built circa 1589 as a second residence for William Bird, a woolen draper, whose house within the city was at Baldwin Street at number 59, close to Bristol Bridge. Like the Red Lodge, it was of 3 stories with 2 rooms on each floor, matching the assessment for 6 hearths and successive lists for the Hearth Tax 1662 to 73, but with 2 attached towers rather than the one of the Red Lodge, seen here in the 1820s in one of those watercolours. And the White Lodge and Baber's Castle underlined that the lodge was a place from which to see and at which to be seen, visible from afar as elite residences with high gabled roofs and battlemented towers. They also offered their owners a view across the city. Both also provided evidence for how the lodge could become a place of permanent dwelling, a villa rather than a lodge. The list for 1662 to 73 indicate that the White Lodge was the only residence within the city of its owner then, Richard Ham, gentleman, and the same was true for William Baber's Castle. So the Red Lodge, built as a banqueting house, and the White Lodge and Baber's Castle all became permanent dwellings in due course, rather than occasional residences for the wealthy in the city. But the Hearth Tax enables us to identify the city centre residences of those who owned garden houses overlooking the city. The 1662 return very conveniently lists a whole block of properties as garden houses on St Michael's Hill, and these are the number of hearths in each garden house, and these are the same people in the centre of the city and how many hearths they had in their city centre house. In some cases, the relationship is evident from a combination of architectural and documentary evidence, as on Stony Hill, the location for at least 3 lodges to the west of the Red Lodge, numbered 1, 2, and 3. One is the lodge of one Richard Jennings, the owner of the sugar house, one of the owners of the sugar house built in the Great House in St Augustine's back, and identifiable only on this distant photograph of the late 19th century. The second on that previous map was that of Thomas Wells, a confectioner, similarly documented in the Hearth Tax for 1668, assessed for 7 hearths, but also recorded in the leases from the Dean and Chapter as a garden ground with a lodge therein, and the records of his house built circa 1664. That's the photograph of the house, showing it from the exterior in the early 20th century, and a drawing of the principal room on the first floor, the initials WTE, T and Elizabeth Wells, and the date 1664, placing it nicely within the period of the Hearth Tax. The lodges or garden houses are also identified from probate inventories where both principal and secondary residences are separately named. George Lane's house at the Hill in 1613, he had a house in the centre of the city as well, is identified as a house in Park Row, newly built by John Jones in 1602. The subject of James Stewart, its occupant in 1746. This schoolmaster historian of Bristol in the 1740s and 30s drew quite a few houses. Very useful to have two different drawings of the same house from the 1730s. This is the lodge from the outside, and this is the garden from the interior. And this was the house he was actually leasing. Another lodge on the outskirts of the city, the house for brewer Andrew Hook at Ashley, and the house of a vintner, Ralph Oliffe, his garden house in Magdalen Lane, separately described in a probate inventory of his possessions. One of a number of lodges built in the former precinct of the Greyfriars, and this one not identifiable in the Hearth Tax list, probably because it was built after 1673. On the slopes above, Richard Jordan's house in the park, one of the garden houses in St Michael's Parish in the Hearth Tax returns for 1662, is shown here on Millard's map of 1673 as a tower-like house, from the inventory probably of one room on each floor. Some townspeople held lodges or garden houses beyond the city. So Robert Cann held a lodge at Stoke Bishop, similar in form to that of Richard Jordan that we just saw, but supplemented by a much larger house built in 1669, which we see here, but still his second residence. And on his manor at Brislington, Sir John Langton, the owner of that shop house, a Leech shop house on Welsh Back, built Langton Court, a lodge of similar plan to Stoke Bishop House. And the Glover Robert Winstone, the owner of the Dutch House at 1 High Street, built a house of similar plan at Oldbury Court, again on the outskirts of the city. And Sir Thomas Day, a soap maker with a house close to his premises close to Bristol Bridge, built 2 lodges on Barton Hill, this one now the Rhubarb Tavern. You see its projecting stair turret at the rear, and the staircase and the chimney piece. All of this English heritage recently refused to list because there wasn't enough left of the shop house, of the lodge. So you will see that lodges and garden houses vary considerably in size. If the 19 garden houses in St Michael's Parish in 1662 are taken as an example, the average number of hearths was between 2 and 3. 5 had 1 hearth, 6 had 2, and 5 had 3. Since this session is focused on 2 cities, I will finish with a few further thoughts on London. I hope Peter Gullew will forgive me for this, as he will know how grateful I was to him for acting as reader for English heritage for my book on Bristol houses prior to it being published. There must be many cities and towns for which the Hearth Tax might be usefully used to provide a street directory for the 1660s and 70s. The Hearth Tax for London and Middlesex being placed at the cusp of the transformation of the city by plague and fire, and now published in 2 volumes, must offer many such opportunities. And future research could utilise the leases for St Bartholomew's Fair, sometimes known as the Cloth Fair, highlighted by John Schofield in his book, The Building of London. From the recorded and surviving street plan, surviving houses, and from documentary sources, it was possible to map the redevelopment of the fair from 1598 to circa 1616, by when some 400 or more fairground booths had been replaced by about 175 houses. Possibly the largest single development in London in the 3 centuries preceding the development of Covent Garden. The critically useful document was the survey by Gilbert Thacker of Sir Henry Richard's estate, dated November 1616, which includes details of all the leases, the names of rooms, the leases, the lessees and the tenants, and much more information. The entries in the survey are arranged in a walking order, perhaps they used by Richard's steward to collect the rent. And the walking order permitted the identification of the properties listed. And for various parts of the survey, it's possible to identify the walking order, and it was that which enabled one to reconstruct a directory, as it were, of the entire development. And it would be possible to, I'm sure people are reading the Hearth Tax volumes with interest to see what information can be gleaned from in this way. But it's possible, I think, to do this for Covent Garden, and the great piazza with the house numbers from the Survey of London, and the entries from the Hearth Tax returns, it's actually possible to see the same sequences coming up. And I was interested to see that Peter's been doing this now in Whitechapel. So I do apologise if this is going to be an irritant. And again, here on the other side of the Grand Piazza, again, from the Survey of London information, the evidence of the walking order becomes very clear. And then one could begin to look at the information in those reconstructed plans in the earlier Survey of London volumes. And of equal interest might be the area around Bishopsgate. This is Power's plan of 1986, and mapping the areas with the highest numbers of, with the buildings with the highest number of hearths per dwelling, and perhaps the inspiration for what Sachs quantified for Bristol. So how many of the dwellings in an area such as Bishopsgate, close to where you come into the city, were inns? That was the question I posed there. So I will end at that point. I think I've ended more or less on time. So thank you.